Welcome back, everyone. Today, we're diving deep into Steve Coll's Ghost Wars.
Ooh, this one's a classic.
Right. It's a fascinating look at the CIA's secret operations in Afghanistan.
From the Soviet invasion in '79 all the way to, well, the day before everything changed.
Exactly, September 10th, 2001.
The book really digs into how the Cold War, kind of fueled the rise of global terrorism.
Yeah, it shows how these seemingly isolated events, they're all connected.
Like a chain reaction.
Exactly. So let's set the stage. 1979, the Soviets invade Afghanistan.
And the U.S. saw this as a chance to give the Soviets their own Vietnam.
Right, a chance to bleed them dry.
So the CIA stepped in. They started supporting the Afghan Mujahideen fighters.
But it wasn't as simple as just sending them money and weapons, was it?
Not at all. The CIA had to work through Pakistan's intelligence agency, the ISI.
Ah, the ISI.
And the ISI, they had their own agenda.
For it.
So you had this triangle of interests, the U.S., the ISI, and then all these different Mujahideen groups.
Each with their own goals.
Exactly. And this is where Ghost Wars really shines. It brings these figures to life,
Like Ahmed Shah Massoud and Gulbuddin Hekmatyar.
Oh, yeah. Massoud, he was incredible. A brilliant strategist, really.
Some called him the only leader who could unite Afghanistan.
Right. He was willing to work with anyone, even his enemies, to achieve his goals.
But the U.S. often ended up supporting Hekmatyar, despite his, brutality.
And his ties to extremist groups?
Because he was favored by the ISI.
Exactly. They thought they could control him.
But that short-sighted approach, it had devastating consequences down the line.
Yeah, it really shows the challenges of these covert operations. Like, you're relying on an intermediary, in this case, the ISI.
And they don't always share your objectives.
Right, and that creates a situation where, unintended consequences are almost inevitable.
The Stinger missiles are a perfect example of that.
Oh, yeah, those Stingers. The U.S. flooded Afghanistan with these anti-aircraft weapons.
Yeah.
Super effective against the Soviets.
But after the Soviets withdrew, hundreds of them went missing.
And the CIA had to scramble to buy them back on the black market.
Talk about an embarrassing cleanup operation.
It really exposed the risk of, arming groups who might not stay on your side.
And it forced the CIA to rethink how they conducted these covert operations.
Right. Made them consider the long-term implications more carefully.
And all this is happening while a young Osama bin Laden enters the scene.
Right. Initially, he was just a financier, supporting the Mujahideen with his own money.
He was actually seen as a valuable asset by both the CIA and the Saudis.
It's wild to think that someone who was once an ally would become, the face of global terror.
And the Soviet withdrawal in '89 just made things even more complicated.
Yeah, it created this power vacuum.
All these different factions fighting for control.
And that's when the Taliban emerged.
And it seems like the CIA completely underestimated them.
They missed a lot of opportunities to influence what was happening. Like, they initially saw the Taliban as a potential stabilizing force.
But they failed to grasp, just how extreme their ideology was.
And as the Taliban consolidated power, they imposed their strict interpretation of Islamic law.
And we see bin Laden's own transformation happening alongside this.
His break with Saudi Arabia was a major turning point. He was furious about U.S. troops being stationed there.
In the land of Islam's holiest sites.
He saw it as a grave offense.
And that really fueled his anti-Western rage.
Which ultimately led to the formation of al-Qaeda.
The CIA started to recognize the threat, but their early attempts to target bin Laden were met with a lot of resistance.
There was a lot of bureaucratic infighting and a lack of political will.
The Clinton administration was really struggling to figure out how to deal with him.
Should they try diplomacy? Military action?
That debate went on for years.
And it really hindered their ability to come up with a clear strategy.
And so you have all these near misses. Plans to capture or kill bin Laden that just never materialized.
Yeah, the proposed raid on his compound in Sudan is a good example.
They considered sanctions, even schemes to lure him into a trap.
It's incredible and kind of frustrating to read about all these missed opportunities.
And wonder, what if they had acted more decisively?
It makes you think about how different things might have been.
Right. But all this time, bin Laden's network was growing stronger.
Evolving from a loosely organized group into a global terrorist organization.
And as we move into the late 90s, the U.S. is facing this stark reality.
The forces they helped unleash are now turning against them.
The Taliban controlling Afghanistan, bin Laden emboldened, and al-Qaeda's threat growing every day.
It's a recipe for disaster. It's really a tough spot for the U.S., Afghanistan in the 90s.
It's almost like they're stuck between a rock and a hard place, trying to figure out how to handle this rising, well, Islamic terrorism.
A real dilemma for the Clinton administration.
I can imagine.
On one hand, you have the intelligence community saying, hey, bin Laden and al-Qaeda, these guys are serious.
A real threat.
But then there's the memory of Somalia.
Yeah, that intervention didn't go well.
Made everyone hesitant about another full-scale military operation.
So what did they do?
They tried to find that middle ground. Sanctions, diplomatic pressure, even some covert ops.
Hoping to disrupt al-Qaeda, maybe even take out bin Laden.
Right. But there are so many obstacles.
Like what?
Well, there was a lot of infighting, intelligence wasn't always great, and no one could agree on the best way forward.
Sounds like a mess.
It was. Coll talks about this debate, should they focus on bin Laden himself or try to dismantle al-Qaeda as a whole?
It's like trying to chop off all the heads of a hydra. You get one, and two more grow back.
Exactly. And throughout the book, you get this feeling of, missed opportunities.
Knowing what we know now.
Yeah, that something terrible is coming.
And it wasn't just about, getting bin Laden. The book shows how much the U.S. relied on Pakistan.
Oh, absolutely. The ISI.
It's like we outsourced our entire Afghan policy to them.
We had during the Soviet War, and we just kept doing it.
Even though their interests didn't always match up with ours.
Exactly. The ISI saw Afghanistan as a way to, counter India.
Their rival.
They wanted a government in Kabul that would be friendly to them and, well, hostile to India.
Makes sense.
And they thought they could use groups like the Taliban for that.
Even though they were extremists?
The ISI, I thought they could control them. Which, obviously, was a mistake.
A big one?
Yeah. Empowering the Taliban, ignoring their support for al-Qaeda, it really paved the way for 9/11.
And the worst part is,
even when it was clear the Taliban were helping al-Qaeda, some in the U.S. government still thought they could be reasoned with.
really?
Yeah, some thought they could convince the Taliban to hand over bin Laden or at least kick out al-Qaeda.
Naive, to say the least.
Incredibly so. The Taliban, they believed in their ideology,
Yeah.
and they saw bin Laden as an ally.
They weren't going to change their minds because of some diplomats or sanctions.
Well,
Yep.
So the U.S. was in a real bind. They knew the Taliban were dangerous.
But they didn't want another war.
Another Vietnam, another Somalia. They were also worried about, backlash from the Muslim world,
So they tried containment.
hoping to keep a lid on things without invading Afghanistan.
But did that work?
Well, Coll makes it clear that containment was never going to be enough. Al-Qaeda was a global organization. They had a network, resources, and a goal.
To attack the U.S.
And they were constantly adapting, finding ways to exploit weaknesses in U.S. intelligence. And the Taliban were giving them a safe place to operate.
A base of operations.
The book talks about a lot of times when the U.S. almost got bin Laden, but they always came up short.
Like that proposed missile strike in '98.
Yeah, that one. Intelligence thought bin Laden was at this training camp.
Seemed like the perfect opportunity to take him out.
But Clinton's decided not to do it.
Worried about civilian casualties, I guess.
Yeah.
And they didn't have 100% confirmation that bin Laden was there.
It's easy to look back now and say they should have done it. But at the time, it was a very difficult decision.
A lot of risk involved.
And it shows just how difficult it is to deal with terrorism. There's no easy answer.
What I find interesting, though, is that Coll doesn't just focus on what the U.S. did wrong.
He tries to understand all sides.
He gets into the motivations, the ideologies of the people involved. Not just the Americans, but the Taliban, al-Qaeda, everyone.
He doesn't paint them as, pure evil. He tries to explain how they came to believe what they believe, how they ended up using such extreme violence.
It's a more nuanced perspective.
Much more. He shows that it's not a simple story of good guys versus bad guys.
It's messy, complicated.
A long history of conflict, clashing interests, and a lot of gray areas.
And that's what makes Ghost Wars so powerful. It's not just a history book. It's a story about human choices and the consequences of those choices.
As we get closer to 9/11 in the book, the tension really ramps up.
Yeah, you can feel it. The CIA, they're getting all this intel about bin Laden's plans, but it's like they're piecing together a puzzle in the dark.
And they're trying to warn people, hey, something bad is coming.
But no one's really listening.
Or at least not enough people are taking it seriously. What Coll does really well, though, is he doesn't make the CIA look incompetent.
Right.
He shows them as, dedicated people doing their best in a really tough situation.
Facing a threat they've never seen before.
Trying to make sense of all this information, connect the dots, But there's so much bureaucracy, so much politics involved.
And no clear leadership, it seems like.
There's this one scene that really sticks with you, the CIA analyst. He's practically screaming that an attack is coming.
On U.S. soil.
And his bosses, they're just not buying it.
It's heartbreaking, knowing what we know now.
It really shows how, even with the best intelligence, sometimes it's not enough.
If people don't act on it.
Exactly. And Ghost Wars shows how those internal struggles, those failures to communicate, they played a big part in what happened on 9/11.
It makes you think about all the systemic problems that might still be out there.
And how they could lead to, well, more tragedies.
The book also goes into detail about the Clinton administration and their internal debates about al-Qaeda.
It's fascinating. Some people wanted to hit them hard, airstrikes, maybe even invade Afghanistan, get rid of bin Laden for good.
A more aggressive approach.
But others were worried about, well, what would happen next? Unintended consequences.
Like starting another war we can't win.
They thought maybe diplomacy, sanctions, those covert ops we talked about, maybe that was enough.
Containment.
But they couldn't agree on one strategy.
And so they wasted time, basically.
Precious time. And Coll, he doesn't take sides. He presents both arguments, lets you see the logic behind each one. It's up to the reader to decide.
That's what makes it such a good book.
Yeah.
It's not black and white.
It's real history, Complicated choices, mistakes were made, and it's not always clear who's right or wrong.
Then there's Ahmed Shah Massoud.
Oh, Massoud. What a figure.
A leader of the Northern Alliance.
Fighting the Taliban.
He was a brilliant military mind, a natural leader.
Both Afghans and Western intelligence, they all respected him.
He knew how dangerous the Taliban and al-Qaeda were. He warned the U.S. about bin Laden.
Over and over again.
He even met with U.S. officials just months before 9/11.
Begging them for help. He said, if you give us the resources, we can defeat the Taliban. We can stop al-Qaeda.
But the U.S., they weren't ready to commit.
They didn't want to get dragged into another Afghan war.
They were still hoping for a peaceful solution with the Taliban.
And then, just 2 days before 9/11,
Massoud is assassinated
by al-Qaeda posing as journalists.
It's a chilling reminder of how connected everything is, how fragile things can be.
And how a single event, even in a faraway place, can change the course of history.
You can't help but wonder, what if he had lived?
Could he have stopped 9/11 from happening?
Could things have been different in Afghanistan?
We'll never know. His death, it's a powerful symbol of the human cost of these conflicts, these ghost wars that most people never even see.
So as you read those final pages of Ghost Wars, you know what's coming. And it's just
heartbreaking
to see all those missed chances, all the mistakes that led to that tragedy.
But it's not just a story about failure.
It's also a story about courage, about the people who fought those wars, often risking everything.
It really makes you think about everything,
It challenges your assumptions about history, about terrorism, about the world.
And it leaves you with more questions than answers.
If you want to understand the war on terror, the world we live in today, then Ghost Wars is a must-read.
It's a book that will stay with you
long after you finish it.
If you're ready to dive in, you can find a link to buy the book in our show notes.
It's an incredible journey.
One that will open your eyes to the hidden forces that have shaped our world.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.